Welcome to the Human Journey channel, where we'll be looking into the ancient history of mankind. We will also be covering subjects on myths, conspiracy theories, unexplained stories that have captivated the human mind for millennia. Please like, subscribe, and share. When we hear the word Atlantis, what do we think of? A highly developed culture that had a futuristic technology, but that one day a natural disaster sank the island deep into the Atlantic Ocean, taking its secrets with it? Maybe our ideas are based on the many movies produced on the subject of Atlantis. Or maybe we just think of it as another myth to go along with the many thousands of myths that humans have invented over time. Well, in this video we will look at the facts, theories, myths and possible locations of the infamous Atlantis. The story of Atlantis has intrigued people for centuries since it was first written about by the Greek philosopher Plato. But is the story of Atlantis just a myth? Or was there truly an advanced civilization that actually once existed? So the question is this: if Atlantis really existed with an advanced civilization, then where is it now? In this video we will look at two potential sites where Atlantis may have been, but also we will look at a very compelling site for Atlantis which most people don't even know exists. But before we look at those possible sites, we need to go back over 2,000 years to 350 BC, to the writings of the only Greek writer to ever mention Atlantis, that of the philosopher Plato. Now Plato gives us a few key clues to the history and location of Atlantis. He describes Atlantis as being completely destroyed by a cataclysmic event that sunk the city deep into the Atlantic Ocean in just a single day and night. Is it possible that an entire civilization could be completely destroyed in one day by a natural disaster? Well, we experience natural disasters all the time today, but none have eradicated a whole civilization. But if we go back over the last 2,000 years, we can clearly see in archaeology where whole cities have been completely destroyed, almost instantly. For example, we have Pompeii, Krakatoa and Herculaneum. So the evidence that a vast civilization could have been wiped out in one night is definitely plausible and possible. However, as stated at the beginning of this video, our understanding of Atlantis may have been tainted by science fiction movies and programs. So we really need to turn to the author of Atlantis, Plato, to tell us what he believes and what really happened to this civilization. So what clues, apart from the destruction of Atlantis, did Plato leave for us? Well, his story of Atlantis is approximately 40,000 words, and goes into great detail about the island city. He tells us that the city was circular with rings of land and water. It was built of red, black and white rocks. The people sacrificed cows or bulls, and also Plato described the land as full of elephants. Plato dated Atlantis to be about 9,000 BC. So in our research we are looking for an area which could closely match Plato's description. So our first possible area for the infamous Atlantis is Malta. Malta is covered in megalithic temples and structures which were built around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, 1,000 years before Stonehenge and the pyramids in Egypt. The mystery about the structures on Malta is that it is unsure who built them. The technology required to move the 20-ton blocks to the site of the structures must have been very advanced for that time. Also, there were carved very elaborate patterns and drawings into the temple walls. In some of the temples, they also used to sacrifice bulls, just as Plato had written. Also, there are what looks like cart tracks all over the island, suggesting that there was some sort of transportation system, maybe even waterways for agriculture. Plato described Atlantis as having waterways within the city. Could these be the same waterways? Unfortunately, one thing is pretty obvious as a discrepancy with Plato's Atlantis. Malta is not at the bottom of the sea. And even though at one point Malta did have elephants grazing on it, that was some 500,000 years ago, long before 9000 BC. So Malta, despite being an island with an advanced civilization that just disappeared, could not have fitted Plato's Atlantis. Also, the advanced civilization was maximum 6,000 years ago, which is 6,000 years later than Plato's 9000 BC. So unfortunately, it seems that Malta does not fit the description of Plato. Our next site and most popular site of Atlantis is the Mediterranean island of Santorini, which lies close to Greece. In 1967, a group of archaeologists found an underground city with elaborate structures and paintings. After researching the find, they concluded that the architects of the structures was a group of ancient people called the Minoans. Now, the Minoans were based on nearby Crete, where they built magnificent palaces and structures. They developed a large culture with art and music. They controlled a large empire long before the Greek world power came fully on the world scene. Interestingly, about 3,500 years ago, this advanced Minoan civilization mysteriously vanished, disappeared off the face of the earth. Could this be the advanced civilization that Plato spoke of? Some of the characteristics of this Minoan city is that it had internal plumbing running through people's homes and aqueduct systems. Modern archaeologists recognize that the Romans had an excellent plumbing system. However, the Minoans had the same system 2,000 years before them. Just imagine our plumbing system being found in the time of Christ. This shows how advanced the Minoans were in Santorini. Another compelling characteristic of Santorini is that the island is circular in shape. Also, the island is full of bull statues and frescoes indicating possible bull veneration or worship, just as Plato spoke of. Another interesting fact about the island of Santorini is that it's covered in rocks that are red, black and white. Again, this fits Plato's description of the island of Atlantis. Another compelling piece of evidence for Santorini is that approximately 3,600 years ago, a volcanic explosion destroyed a huge chunk of the island, killing off the advanced Minoan society. Originally, the island was a complete circular island with a volcano near its center. But when the volcano erupted, not only was it an explosion that destroyed approximately 8 miles of landmass, but also caused a huge crater in which the ocean then flooded in at such a rate it would make Niagara Falls look like a dripping tap. So when we look at the island of Santorini today, we are really looking at an island that once had an advanced civilization, but was destroyed by a natural disaster and then covered over by the sea, just as Plato described. However, we have a problem. Plato dated Atlantis to 12,000 years ago, but the Minoans and their demise happened 3,600 years ago. So there again is a nearly 6,500 year difference. However, scholars are unsure whether Plato meant 9,000 years or 900 years. Was it a mistranslation? Unfortunately, this is what happens to myths. They can alter or change over time. Is it more likely that Plato was just relaying a story from the past? Could it just have been a myth all along? Was Plato sending a message to humanity that we live on a volatile world, and at any time, even at our peak advancement, we could be snuffed out by nature? So could Atlantis have existed but turned into myth as a warning to us all? This now moves us on to our last possibility for the Atlantis myth, and it's in a place where most people have never heard of or seen. But the evidence for this area being Atlantis is very compelling. Now, when it comes to the myth of Atlantis, we have to understand that Plato didn't invent the myth. Plato admits that the story was handed down to him from his family members. Apparently his distant relative Solon, the poet and politician who lived approximately 600 BC, learned of the Atlantis story in Africa, Egypt to be exact, from the Egyptian priests who translated the hieroglyphs to Solon. So Africa is our next destination to find the island of Atlantis. West Africa to be precise, in the Sahara Adrar Plateau, Mauritania. So this structure is called the Richat structure, or the Eye of Africa, and you can clearly see how it got this name. Now just compare this artist's impression of Plato's Atlantis with the shape and dimensions of the Richat structure. It's very compelling, and even though academics today call Atlantis pseudo-history, it's very interesting that Plato describes a place that fits extremely closely to a destination many thousands of miles away, of which Plato never claimed to visit. Another interesting fact was that the information handed down by Solon, eventually to Plato, describes Atlantis as being destroyed by a cataclysmic event around 12,000 years ago. This date coincides with the Younger Dryas period, where the Earth went through a massive temperature change, causing glaciers to melt and fresh water rushing into the oceans and causing sea levels to rise. And this was over a period of 14,000 to 11,000 years ago. The sea levels rose at a minimum of 21 meters, or around 65 feet, and flooded a large area of the planet. Interestingly, these dates coincide with the Atlantis myth and its demise around 12,000 years ago. Also, as mentioned earlier in the video, Atlantis was supposed to be made up of circles of land and water. So take a look at the Richat structure again. It's clearly similar to what Plato describes. Also, the size of the Richat structure is also very interesting, as it's approximately 40 to 50 kilometers, or around 30 miles across at its tip. However, the most interesting aspect of this structure is that the outer circle's diameter is approximately 23.5 kilometers, or 14.5 miles across. Why is this interesting? Well, Plato described the diameter of Atlantis to be approximately 23.5 kilometers in our measurements today across. Is that just a coincidence? Or is there more to the Richat structure than we know? Also, in Plato's description, he speaks of mountains in the north, sheltering the southern part of the island. And clearly here we have mountains to the north giving shelter to the south. Plato also described the mountains as flowing with rivers. Again, as you can see in this photo, rivers clearly used to flow from the mountains down towards the Richat structure, just as Plato described. Imagine how this place would have looked with flowing rivers at full capacity, flowing down into the basin. With the elevated stone circle structures, you would have circles of water and land, just as Plato described again. Also, even though the area is a dry desert, when water was flowing constantly into the basin, this would have caused lush green vegetation to grow, which would have made the area look paradisaic, like a Garden of Eden surrounding Atlantis. Also, Plato describes Atlantis as having an opening in the south to the sea. In this photo, we can clearly see an opening to the south side of the structure. Another interesting fact is that if you look at the location of the structure, you will notice that it's not close to the Atlantic Sea. However, from above, you can clearly see what looks like some kind of wave pattern, like a tidal wave or tsunami just crashed into the land, swallowing up all in its path, including Atlantis. Then once receded, would have left thousands and thousands of tons of sand on the plain, making the area dry and desert-like, with little plant life, just as we see in the Sahara Desert area. Plato also described Atlantis as becoming cut off from the sea so that ships could no longer sail to the island. And as we can see in the Richat structure, it is landlocked, and as mentioned before, it looks like at some point it could have been connected to the ocean, possibly by a large estuary, but was destroyed by maybe a tsunami or a tidal wave. And once the waters had receded, it may have actually changed the structure of the land, so that the ocean could no longer reach the Richat structure, causing an impenetrable barrier to ships. Now, as mentioned earlier, Plato described the city as being constructed with red, black and white rocks. The Richat structure is also covered in multicolored rocks, including blue, red, black and white rocks. Also in the past, archaeologists have excavated the area and found that there used to be freshwater springs that flowed from underground to the surface, making potable or drinking water easily accessible. The interesting fact about this is that any water that has been found in the area was only salt water. So the question is this: how could salt water be in this area considering it's 250 miles away from the sea? This all seems to be confirming that at some point the sea reached the area either by some kind of estuary or flood, or maybe even both. Plato even described Atlantis as having two springs of fresh water, one was cold and the other was hot. Another key description Plato mentions about Atlantis is that the land was covered with elephants. And as we know, elephants are native to Africa. But also in the Richat area, many elephant bones have been discovered. And on the walls in the area, many drawings have been found of elephants. Archaeologists have also discovered tools, jewelry and artifacts in the Richat area, just confirming that it was once inhabited. This is very interesting because the area is so remote and not conducive to life now, but obviously was at some time in the past. Okay, so let's do a recap on the Richat structure. It's unique, the only one known on Earth. It shares the same characteristics with Atlantis, such as shape, diameter and composition, such as black, red and white rocks. The area was flooded with salt water around 12,000 years ago, the same time as the Younger Dryas period. It has mountains to the north and once had flowing rivers. These rivers would have caused green vegetation to grow, making the area around the Richat structure look like a paradisaic Garden of Eden. Within the structure, it had freshwater springs, despite only salt water being found in the area, some 250 miles away from the sea. There was artifacts found in the area, along with elephant bones and carvings. So, could the Richat structure have been Plato's Atlantis? Well, one of the problems with any area that people claim was Atlantis is that no one area completely fits Plato's description. There is always some points which just don't fit. So we really need to ask ourselves a question: Did Atlantis ever really exist? Or was Plato literalizing a myth? Maybe Atlantis was a myth handed down generations until it became a fact. The truth of the matter is, we may never know. But it is extremely interesting that so many people around the world are looking for Atlantis and are so intrigued by its story. So what do you think then? Could Atlantis have ever existed? Or was it just a story invented by a man and then turned into a literal event? Please leave your thoughts and comments in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.